Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab, all on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good afternoon and welcome to this virtual event hosted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies. My name is Joseph Majkut. Here at CSIS, I'm the Director of the Energy Security and Climate Change Program. And whether you're joining us from Washington, D.C. or anywhere around the world, we're very glad that you are here with us today. I'm looking forward to an incredible discussion. Our guest is Director General Gerassimos Thomas from the European Commission, where he heads up the unit that covers both taxation and customs for Europe. And Director General Thomas finds himself at the center of some very interesting policy developments for how Europe is going to try to achieve its goals related to a green transition, a digital transition, and building back better from the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. A bit of housekeeping before we begin. If you've got questions for Mr. Thomas, we have the website on which you're viewing this event should have a question function. We have folks here in the room who are going to be lobbing or collating those questions and handing them up for our discussion and a period at the end where I'll be offering those in addition to my own. So we welcome your participation. We are sad that you are not here with us today here in the room, but we look forward to a return to more in-person and spirited conversations in the tradition of CSIS. With that, I'd like to introduce Director General Thomas, who's got some opening remarks, and then we will move to a broader conversation. Mr. Thomas, welcome to CSIS.
Thank you very much. Thank you for hosting me, and good afternoon to everybody here in the US, and good evening for those of you that might be connecting from elsewhere. So, I would like as a few words to raise three issues. The first is the importance of the EU-US transatlantic relationship and our engagement in multilateralism. That is extremely important in this moment of time. It was important last year during the COVID crisis with a very robust and coordinated response, in the economic front. And I think it is important as we get out of the crisis, and trying to ensure that there is international taxation, corrects some of what we believe, both EU and the US, where some of shortcomings of the international taxation system, and we have to work together on this. So this implementation of the OECD tax deal is at the center of our cooperation. And the third issue is, coming after COP26, I think there is an incredible momentum an EU-US relationship working together in the implementation of the commitments that were made in Glasgow. And some of them, they started with under EU-US leadership. And I think it is important that we have a responsibility to implement and engage on them. The OECD deal started building up under this administration in July, G20 in Venice, and then we concretized after a lot of work in October, an incredible agreement to reform to Pillar 1, Pillar 2, reform corporate taxation effectively with engagement from the EU, US, 136 countries in total. And it has not been easy, including within Europe, to get all the 27 member states agree, to this. We need unanimity in the EU, and we have managed with good cooperation with the OECD, EU, US to find a good way forward. So on this front, the EU is going to move very quickly. Pillar 2, we are in the final stages of discussions on these model rules for the implementation of Pillar 2, and we are going to enact Pillar 2 through legislation in the EU just before Christmas. So we will introduce legislation already before Christmas to enact implementation of Pillar 2. We will do this with EU legislation in order to ensure harmonious implementation, also to make sure that there is legal certainty within the EU. And then we will work with the OECD in the first quarter of next year, 2022, to make sure that we have agreement on the multilateral treaty. And there is a very tight timetable. As you all know, it is part of the deal. The deal is not only about the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 principles, but it is also about the timetable that all the 136 countries commit to get this done by the end of 2023. And it is very, very demanding, but we are working very closely within the OECD framework and bilaterally with the US to make it a reality. It is important. It eliminates the race to the bottom between jurisdictions. All of them, they will have under Pillar 2 a transparent way to make sure that we have a minimum effective tax rate of 15%, at least 15%. And then with the agreement of Pillar 1, in a certain way, we will modernize the corporate tax system, bringing formulaic apportionment and the reallocation of taxing rights through formulaic apportionment, among large multinational groups. It is very important, very much needed, and we are committed to that. It is at this stage already a part of the domestic EU agenda, and we are committed to work internationally to make it happen. Equally, the commitments on the environment for Europe are very strong for 2050. We have made a climate law, so it's legally binding. Legislation has been adopted by the European Council and the European Parliament that we will become a zero carbon economy by 2050. But we have also committed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 55% in 2030. So this decade is a crucial decade, for delivering for the zero carbon economy. And there are three important components in our strategy. The ETS, carbon pricing, is a very important component in our strategy to deliver on carbon neutrality. ETS and carbon pricing, Europe has a tradition to that, but now that we need to accelerate our reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, we put a lot of weight on this instrument. ETS provides revenue. It's through this revenue that we will finance the transition costs, because we will have a social fund that comes out of strengthening of the ETS. This will allow us to help us, the poor households and all the parts of the economy that have difficulties making this transition. So ETS is the main instrument, the main tool that we will use to move to this 55% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 55. We will expand the coverage of the sectors covered by ETS, and we will reform the instrument and the tool of this policy tool to make sure that it delivers. Then we have some regulation. As you know, we have quite a bit of environmental and other regulation in Europe, but we have a new regulation coming up on some of the biofuels, some of the renewable energy. We need some regulation, but it has to be combined with the market-based measures of the ETS, and then we have some taxation. On the taxation front, we have a regime in Europe where we have some minimum, let's say, federal level taxes, and then in each country they can have different taxes above this. So what we will try to do, and what we have proposed to do, is to change the structure on incentives in the taxation front. So we will progressively, over a period of 10 years, make the higher taxes for fossil fuels compared to electricity and clean sources of energy. And in order to, that is the objective. And the way to get there we will do two things. The first thing is we will eliminate all the exemptions. At the moment, in certain parts of the economy, we have exceptions. So we have an energy tax on something, on the petrol or on the gas, and then suddenly we say for certain types of industry, we have an exception. So we will remove these exceptions. Or we might have some exception for agriculture, even if the tax rate for agriculture is very small. So there are 2-3 countries, for example, in the Union that have an exception of taxation for agriculture. The others, they do not have the same. So we will try to create a level playing field by removing the exceptions, making sure that we have a simple and comparable system. The second thing we will do, we will take the tax base at the moment, like in the US, energy taxed in volume. You tax dollars per liters, euros per liters in Europe. This gives a competitive advantage or a comparative advantage, to fossil fuels. So we will move the taxation on an energy content basis. So this will neutralize the effect of taxation between fossil fuels and renewable energy. So we will move the basis on energy content, and last, over a 10-year period, we will increase a bit the minimum rates. And therefore, the minimum rates will increase over time, and they will get inflation adjusted. And fourth, I'm sorry, I forgot, is we are bringing into the energy taxation some new sectors that are, for the moment, they do not have a European minimum taxation. They might have in one or the other country, so we also bring other sectors in. So this is very important. It's accompanying the reform and the energy transition that we have, as part of the Green Deal, and it is quite important for our domestic agenda. Last but not least, we believe that it is important, as Europe, also to give incentives, to our producers around the world that want to export to Europe to move to sustainable production processes. So we have made a proposal for a carbon border adjustment mechanism. This is for us an environmental measure. We have a very simple tool in this initial phase. This initial phase starts in 2026 and covers the period from 2026 to 2030. What we are planning to do is to reduce the current mechanism that we have in Europe with free allowances, which is our way to protect our industries from carbon leakage. And we try to remove this protection and replace it with incentives to third country producers to have green production facilities. So we will look at the carbon content of imports in steel, aluminum, fertilizer, cement, and electricity. And these measures is addressed to companies, and if the imported goods have the same CO2 content than the ones that we have in Europe, this is fine. And if there is a difference, there has to be an adjustment that the companies have to buy the certificates of a national ETS, so they will have the same instrument that we have for our domestic production. This is, in our view, very powerful, both for individual companies that are making new investments in third countries to serve Europe, primarily in the neighborhood. So by making their new investments green, they will be able to have, for the products in question, low CO2 footprint, and therefore, they will benefit from the same, they will not have any additional certificates to buy at import. And we see already a positive response also from some of our neighboring countries like Turkey or Ukraine or Russia, that they plan now to give similar incentives to their companies to green, some with pricing, some like Ukraine, they will introduce an ETS system by 2025, so before sebum comes into place, or Turkey or Russia, they're thinking of carbon taxation. So all the countries and all the producers, effectively, they see that the medium-term future requires the use of these tools. We have chosen a pathway that it is not very aggressive, starting in 2026, and for these sectors, we give a 10-year period for the whole instrument to work. And I think we give a quite bit of time in the next 2-3 years until 2025 to discuss with our international partners to see how it will work. So it is important for our international sort of environmental diplomacy, but it is also important to work with the private sector again to give them the right incentives for them when to produce products that are comparable with what we produce here. So I will say, I will stop here. I'm happy to answer your questions. I think it's probably better than me going long on a long speech on a number of other things that we are working on.
Well, maybe we can get through what I'm sure are only a few questions regarding global minimum taxation, environmental taxation in Europe, and carbon border adjustments, and leave plenty of room at the end for final thoughts. Yeah. As I said, I'm very happy that you're here today. I think that the full package of issues that you're working on is really interesting, and in particular, as I was preparing for our discussion today, I found that there were a lot of places where there was more similarity in what these tools are trying to achieve than I might have originally thought. And I'd like to start there if we can before discussing some details. In particular, it seems to me that one of the, let's take the global minimum tax rule as an example, right? That's a place where countries have been competing, as you say, for years, trying to race to the bottom, to capture business investment, or provide safe harbor for companies away from taxation. And now countries have decided to say, well, actually, we need to have some minimum rules. So it turns it inverts the way countries are relating to each other, I think, between one where they were competing to now one where there's some degree of cooperation. But as you look at the next step, which is implementation, are there areas where you think countries kind of will continue to compete, whether that's on the style of exemptions that companies can seek, or is there a spirit of cooperation in trying to maintain a minimum rate through this kind of I believe that's the Pillar 2 part of the agreement, that you and your colleagues have been able to kind of commit to?
Well, I think what Pillar 2 does is it puts a floor to this race to the bottom. Everybody recognizes that there is a way that we have to have a fair society, that we need government revenue, particularly after the pandemic. Governments, people, the electorate understand that we need to have public spending in order to have the hospitals running, and we are not even through. I'm happy that I heard that the mandate for masks will go out in Washington, but it's not everywhere. All over the world, there are still challenges on public health. So I think revenue is required, and I think this OECD deal does not try to harmonize everything, neither globally nor we try to do this in Europe. It tries to put a floor. It tries to ensure transparency, and it tries to make sure that we calculate, taxes in the same way. Mm-hmm. So this minimum is not only the minimum that it is important. It is, the way you calculate the effective. It is comparable all over the world, and I think this is good. And we put our energy as policymakers, but also the companies. We put our energy in doing other things. Companies can compete in products. In excellence, in transition, in technology, in innovation. There are plenty of things to, to compete. And of course, countries above this minimum, they still have different needs. The different taxation levels, they are not only a matter of competition between countries. There are different needs in the society. the structure, for example, in Europe, we have if we move away from corporate taxation, we have different labor taxation, different consumption taxes are much higher in Europe than in the US. So I think it is not realistic to have a sort of a harmonized level. What we need is what we have agreed to have some minimum levels that are comparable. And then we have Pillar 1. What is Pillar 1? Pillar 1 is a recognition that we do not live in the industrial age anymore, that or in the farm age, because the current tax system is like, we had farms, and then people, were getting a tax on the farm production and, redistributing it. Then we had, industrial factories producing products, and now the digital economy and the way the multinational works are a bit different. So this is an adaptation to the reality that multinational groups and the sectors where they operate is different around the world. I think it's long overdue that we recognize that there's some reassignment of taxing rights according to the jurisdictions where the companies sell their services or their products. And I think it is difficult to agree technically and to implement because we have running systems and we cannot stop, get out of the train and jump to another train. It will not work. We cannot have disruption. But I think we have found a good way gradually now to make sure that we make this transition starting from the big companies and then going to lower levels over the 10 years. So I think it is important. It also shows the willingness for this agreement, shows that, the first tweet of Commissioner Gentiloni, Paolo Gentiloni, who is responsible for in Europe for this, was when this agreement was done, multilateralism is back. So, it shows the willingness of the countries to confront these big challenges, whether it is fairness, whether it is, distribution of income, whether it is climate change. We can only confront these two things and many others probably, but certainly these things all together, and we cannot confront alone. Take the environment, it will be a zero-sum game if, each one was trying to compete with each other. So.
Thank you. So one of the other things that a lot of these mechanisms that you're talking about have in common is they read as slightly more complicated to me than previous implementations of tax policy, right? So in the global minimum case, governments and companies are going to have to find ways to observe and report tax or profits and income and investments made abroad and domestically in a way that they might not have before. Is there anything you're watching in terms of implementation that external viewers should watch as well to make sure that these systems work as intended?
I think that, of course, there will be transition costs. I think the Pillar 2, it is not so complicated in the sense that, it will have more transparency on how taxes are calculated in the group as opposed to individual companies. So it will oblige, let's say, the companies to, to look across the group and tax authorities to look across the group. In the past, the tax consultants were doing that in any case, so now they will share this with the tax authorities. And I don't think, there are technical difficulties, but I don't think it is so difficult. And then in low tax jurisdictions, taxes will go up. And that in some countries that you're in, and therefore the groups have to adjust. But I think also corporate social responsibility has changed, and I think we do not see, we see understanding from the international community, probably the private sector, going into this change, they will have to see all the details, and therefore we will see how they react. But I think that there is a good moment where the public and the private sector, they come together and say this, we have to find a way to do it. Pillar 1, this is, reassigning taxing rights around the world, is a bit more complicated. So the technical difficulties that you see and the legal difficulties is are a bit more complicated. That's why we need this a more complicated agreement, because we will reassign taxing rights from one country to another, and this is more fundamental. It is difficult, it will take a bit more time, but on the other hand, there is work that is being done that for the last 15 years. I mean, this is the moment to close the deal. This is not the moment that we make the deal. So we come, I'm lucky to come at the end, now to close the deal, but this is a deal where people have been working on this deal for 15 years. It happens in companies as well, I don't know, or it happens in foreign policy, people are working on an agreement, and there is a moment that it comes and, an agreement that is possible, even if has not been possible before. So I think it's good, and we have to take advantage of this moment, and I think the political leaders have shown a lot of responsibility of all the countries that they have, still some doubts. They have gone forward and they have pledged to go ahead with this. Again, it is a bit like the climate. You saw the closing in Glasgow. Some of you might have seen the last comments by Executive Vice President Timmermans. He says everybody has his lists of additional things he or she wanted to put on the table, but this was a moment to close it,
Right.
and that is always in business or in politics. There is a moment to close the deal.
Yeah, it's easy to forget that so much of the task when you're pursuing policy entrepreneurism, either as a policymaker or as a scholar, is in preparing for moments of opportunity. They don't always exist, right? We will invite questions about the global minimum tax, but during the Q&A, and I know that this is an exciting development for our peers from the economics community, but I'd like for you and I to travel back to your origins. Sir, you were, before you were directing this commission's work on customs and taxation, you worked in the energy services, and yet before that you were the energy minister for the Greek government. Very clearly, we're at a moment of time where it feels like we've passed a point of no return on climate ambition turning from aspirational to ambitious, if I may. We're definitely seeing that in Europe. What was your readout on Glasgow? What did you see coming out of COP that either echoes the march of multilateralism or creates cause for concern?
A lot of good and constructive action that needs to be pursued. I mean, it has not solved all the problems, but everything that was done in Glasgow, it's a positive step in a way in solving the problem. So we kept the 1.5 degree scenario in scope. We pledged money, more money, by donors and by the private sector, and we had agreement on the rule book. So all the ingredients. This is a long-term marathon that we have to run, and even if we had a faster sprint, we still would have to be, running. And I think it's good. That's why I came here this week to discuss implementation. So we have no time to lose. So not even weeks to lose, not even days to lose. So I think it is important. It was a very good EU-US initiative on methane. I think the coal phase out and down.
Phase down.
Phase down and out. It's good. I think it is very important that it is recognized that coal will be out and down. I think personally, for the short period I was a minister, I was legislated the closing down of all coal plants in Greece, accelerated this from 247 to 220, basically 23, except for one plant in 2028. It is possible, it is feasible, it is necessary, and it makes economic sense, most of all. It makes economic sense. It's economically unsustainable in most parts of the world, not everywhere, we have to recognize that, but in most parts, it's a very short-term action. It's economically unsustainable to run. In some others, we have to organize the transition. And of course, in all cases, we have to make the just transition. That's what we have done in Europe. We have a just transition fund that was already adopted 2 years ago. We need to accompany this process but the process has to be done. So it's very important, and I think it is very necessary. I think it was also extremely good in this area of coal, the EU-US supported initiative on South Africa, 8.5 billion pledge to help make a showcase of such an important country with huge challenges, and have the necessary financing to adjust the industry sector and accompany the just transition. I think these are things when we can learn from each other, that we can work multilaterally, work bilaterally, and get them done. So I'm very optimistic that they were done, they were agreed, and work will continue. But the challenge is huge, as we all know, and we need to continue.
And that's why some of the tools that you mentioned in your talk, which I cannot let rest, to me are very fascinating, right? So you're coming to Washington. You're at the center of Europe putting together a carbon border adjustment. How has the response been? This is a tool that a lot of people in DC are wondering about, that some of them are worried about. What's the broad message for how you expect this to be implemented and how it fits into a multilateral response to climate change?
Yeah, I think that as the speed of adjustment increased and increases, and the ambition around climate increases, every country around the world recognizes that we need to broaden the toolbox on how we deal with this transition, and also everybody agrees that the risks of carbon leakage are increasing for whether it is in the West, in the East, everywhere. And then people need to figure out how to deal with that. So the best positive thing that we were a bit more advanced because we have an ETS system that works for quite some time. Mm-hmm. We chose to do a carbon border adjustment that it is mirroring our ETS system. And the design of it was not easy, but finally we opted for this, and we made a very simple system and very gradual, and from now to 2035. I think our choice gave comfort to our partners. So whether it is at the level of G20, whether it is the level of the WTO, our partners, first of all, are interested to discuss it. Nobody rejects it, and everybody recognizes that they have, and we have given them the time by leaving this period up to 2025, 26, we have given the time for this dialogue. Mm-hmm. And this dialogue has to happen bilaterally and multilaterally. Mm-hmm. And the role of international institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD is important in also getting a lot of the technical, let's say, analysis that it is necessary to have this debate broad-based. So it is true that in the US, it's so far nothing has been decided, but I think I had a number of meetings, and I will have a number of meetings tomorrow from both sides of the House, the political spectrum, and with the administration and the business world. I think everybody requires that it is something to be discussed. I think in the US it is not, it's no secret that no federal decisions are made. Of course, there are some states with whom we have, and you have the examples that they are more positive on some of these measures. We have learned, for example, from the when we made our proposal for sebum on electricity, we have looked at California and we have discussed a lot with them because they are the only ones that have such a mechanism on electricity. So there are, like in technology, that we have good cooperation with US companies or US laboratories or so in innovation. Also in this area of taxation, there is good interlocutors with whom we have a good and fruitful dialogue, and that's what we intend to do, and we intend to continue. And I'm traveling to Canada later this week. Of course, then carbon pricing is already, right, part of their policy agenda, and we will see how it works for them. And therefore, I think you probably, the U.S. businesses, the U.S. administration, the U.S. authorities, they are also looking into that.
So trade tools and border adjustment are like relatively familiar in other spaces, right? You mentioned consumption taxes earlier. Border adjustment for consumption taxes is something that firms are pretty comfortable with. When you look at creating the CBAM, and I've read the proposed document, or I've read the proposal, there's sort of two things that you have to be able to measure pretty well: carbon content of goods, and the price that's paid for carbon. And in particular, the proposal is very clear that prices on carbon are what can see some sort of reciprocal consideration, at the border, right? So if goods are coming in from a exporting country to Europe, and they felt a carbon price in their own country, then there's some accommodation for that when they are paying certificates. We don't necessarily enjoy that in the U.S. because we don't have a federal carbon price. There's like small state level carbon pricing, but it's not sure that it necessarily applies to the goods that are being first considered for your CBAM. So, how should U.S. policymakers, if I may, think about the CBAM as a tool that Europe is standing up, and what are functional and helpful responses? Carbon border adjustments have some support in Congress, but that's a matter of legislation. What can be done in the meantime to make sure that the system works?
Yeah, let me, if I may, just rephrase a little bit your description of CBAM.
Fine.
In the sense that you put, there is a different hierarchy. CBAM is the CBAM that we have proposed is a very primitive, let's say, carbon border mechanism. First of all, it only looks at raw materials. It doesn't look at products, because a lot of the academic discussion is, how do you calculate the carbon content of steel within car parts? But we only deal with raw materials.
Right.
So what we need to do in the European CBAM, we measure the carbon, the CO2 footprint of a ton of imported steel, a ton of imported fertilizer or cement or aluminum. So it is only raw materials. And the second thing I think it's important to keep in mind is this is a mechanism that works on products and not on countries. So you can have a country X, we have many neighboring countries from where we import these materials. I don't know whether it is Belarus or Ukraine or Turkey. So you have different importers with sort of production facilities with different characteristics. So what we are saying is that we look at the time of import and the CO2 footprint, and it could be that there are 5 producers in one country, and depending on how they have invested in green technology, one might be as green as in Europe. So this particular exporter into Europe will pay nothing. So the pricing, the carbon price issue is a secondary, let's say, consideration.
Right.
The first issue is you get in the border and you say, is the CO2 content good or not good, how big it is? And how the CO2 content has been achieved in each country, it's different. In some country, it's pure private investment because the company is part of a multinational group that has new green factories. Or in another country, it could be that they have a heavy regulation, and therefore, the factory they have to be driven by regulatory processes. And in some countries, they have carbon pricing like us. But CBAM is neutral in the first level. We look at how much CO2 there is in this ton of steel, and this is important. Then, if there is a difference, and the company has to buy the importer has to buy some certificates at the time of import, then it comes in the discussion, can one subtract, has there been some carbon price paid domestically, it's paid in Canada, in New Zealand, or whatever. And I think it's at this level that, the carbon pricing comes into. But we have designed an instrument that fits not only to countries who have carbon pricing, it fits to everybody, and it fits to companies that have different ways to invest. Now, in the US companies, we are starting the dialogue. The fact of the matter is, in these products, we do not have imports from the US.
Right.
So at the moment, there is not any concrete case. We have one company or so, a bit of steel. So over the next, until 2030, we do not have economic interests. And therefore, we have the time to find out the way, first of all, in the first 4 years until 2025 with everybody. So it's in a certain way, we can discuss this from a comfortable position on which we do not have any financial flows that, they will impact this. Now, as I said, everybody faces this problem, and that's why everybody gradually, it is a need that comes from the market, and that's why there has been one or the other initiative on carbon border mechanisms, and there is an active discussion in all countries. They have not figured out or have not decided yet how exactly to do it, but it's always in the multilateral tables. It is in the table of the G20. It is now formally in the next presidency in the G7 agenda. There has been in the G20 agenda. Last minute, because of two countries, it was not formalized. So I think post-COP it could be that these two countries also agree. There is a multilateral discussion. So I think we are confident that this issue will be part of the discussion. It does not necessarily, we do believe that carbon pricing is the most efficient way and the most efficient tool in the toolbox to deal with climate change, as the IMF believes or so. But there are other ways, and I'm sure that we will find a good ideas together with the U.S.
Interesting, but the right way to think about it in terms of implementation is how are firms doing on carbon intensity, and the path to low carbon intensity can be charted multiple ways.
Yeah.
Excellent. I invite questions from our audience. We'll turn to those in a moment across the whole range of things that we've discussed. But multilateral dialogue. I've heard you mention the WTO. Not all countries are comfortable with sebum. There's been some pushback. How do you see those conversations developing? In particular, developing nations have issued concerns about sebum as a mechanism spreading. So, how can Europe kind of make sure or ensure that these tools are not being used in a punitive or coercive way and are accomplishing like broader goals of multilateral cooperation?
It is true that there has been a lot of discussion and a worry, I would say, before the summer when we made our proposals by partners, both by sectors and by countries. Say, what will Europe do? Mm-hmm. Will they do something that we will face a wall and suddenly we will not be able to export our goods? Will they do many products? How quickly they will move? I think the after our proposal, I think we have moved from objections of principle to technical discussions. There has been different discussions in the WTO, legitimate discussions on technical aspects, but we do not have any blockage or any issues of principle in the WTO. People discuss, understand, look at the different aspects. I think we see, and as a positive element, the way the discussions in the WTO have developed since after we presented our proposal. It's another thing what people were saying before we made our proposal, but now the discussions in the WTO are, as they should be, focusing on the substance and very technical. The same, many countries that had worries before, we have now they have looked at their domestic situation, their domestic policies, and they think that they can live with this. There are many countries with whom I had discussions before and after, and their position has been modified. The countries, there is one particular developing country that it is impacted. It has a lot of aluminum export to Europe. given that the number of sectors is very small and the very precise trade flows, we are working together with our development policy colleagues, and we have the international partnership budget, and we will help this country transition. So for them is an opportunity in this particular case, instead of to turn it as an opportunity to green the production of the big producer of aluminum, and I think we will do that. And it turns from a negative measures, we have turned it collectively, putting our different tools together to something positive that will have a net benefit effect for the environment. So there are solutions, and in all these solutions, the key is to engage. And if you engage, you find solution, you find ideas. If you do not engage and you stick to a discussion of broad principles and objections of principles, then it doesn't work. But we do recognize that our carbon border adjustment mechanism is like a pilot, on which we need to build. And that to build on this, we need multilateral engagement, and we need the engagement of the US and Canada and other big countries. And I think that's what we are trying to achieve, and we are getting this because we have moved in a proportional way, and I think proportionate and proportional way, and I think that works for the moment. I hope it continues to work, and the engagement with the businesses is very important. Mind you that the businesses, they face their own moment of sustainable performance, and it comes also from the financing. Financing is a big driver for businesses to look at the sustainability of their investments. So it's the complementarity of the different tools that eventually also provides this issue. And when it comes to developing countries, the change of policies on the multilateral development banks and the focus of the resources of the multilateral development banks also will be fundamental to complement these discussions.
So my last question speaks to complementarity. Right before COP, there was an announcement the EU and the US have forged an agreement to reduce some trade barriers related to steel and aluminum, and then team up and come to an agreement on establishing standards for clean trades in those goods, and then and that may kind of in the future also limit market access for non-clean versions of those goods. Do you see that as a complement, or tools like that as a complement to border adjustment?
Well, strictly speaking, this is the competence among of our trade colleagues. Yeah. So, and the carbon border adjustment mechanism is not a trade instrument. For us, it's an environmental instrument.
Right.
But when it comes to the intended effects, there is some complementarity, the way you describe it. But for us, we do not, let's say, treat them, in the same way. This was a specific, the steel and the case and the tariffs. I think it is a great example of good cooperation that we find a solution. We moved of the lack of trust. There is trust, and that's on which we can build. And I think the way it will be implemented, the follow-up to this agreement, it will have a positive effect on the environment, like sebum has a positive effect on the environment in production in third countries. So there are two different instruments that move in the same direction, like many other instruments, like the rules on financing, taxonomy, etc., to get a positive impact of the environment. In that way, they are complementary, that they will have a positive impact on the environment, but not that they are part of exactly the same toolbox.
Excellent. I'm getting the flashing red light. There's so much interesting to talk about. Unfortunately, we've exhausted our broadcast session. I hope to our virtual audience that you saw your questions reflected in the course of our conversation. I was able to work in several things. Director General Thomas, we greatly appreciate that you came to CSIS. I think personally speaking, I think the work that you're doing is very interesting, taking brave stances, trying to implement new policy instruments to address our biggest challenges. And I hope that our work here can help inform your work, and we look forward to a productive relationship going forward. So with that, I think if I could offer you the floor if you would like to close. Otherwise, thanks for being here at CSIS.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for listening in, for your engagement. And I think we are very open in Europe to talk to you, to talk to the governments, and talk to the private sector as well in all these issues that we have to work together. I think that's the main message that we have from now on to get all these things done. We want to work hand in hand across jurisdictions, but also with public and private sector.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming. To our virtual audience, thank you for attending. CSIS thanks you for your attention, and this should be available on our website shortly as an archived conversation. So thank you and good night.